Number 10 is about organisms and environments. The work that we're doing in ontology was initially motivated by work which was being done in the wake of the Human Genome Project. So the Human Genome Project was just one project. There was also a mouse genome project, there was a fly genome project, and now there are hundreds and hundreds, maybe hundreds of thousands of genome projects. And the problem which the successful decoding of the human genome created was that you can't really do biology when the data that you're dealing with looks like that. You have to associate genomic data with data which is described using traditional biological expressions. So you want to know where a particular gene or where a particular piece of DNA is located inside the cell, or what molecular functions it's connected with, such as when a protein binds with another protein, or what biological processes are implicated downstream of that molecular function. For instance, when a cell divides, or when one organism perceives something in its environment, or when an organism dies, and so forth. And so, an ontology, the first successful scientific ontology, was created in round about 1998, which is several epochs ago in bioinformatics time. It was created by representatives from the human, mouse, fish, and fly biology worlds, who agreed that they wanted to share information about their respective genomes using a controlled vocabulary which would capture biological expressions in these three groups. So names for cell components, names for molecular functions, names for biological processes, but in such a way that the same expressions would be used by all the biologists working across all the species for which genomes had been created or decoded. And so the Gene Ontology made it possible to do experiments on mice, to do genomic assays on the mouse DNA, connected, for instance, with giving the mouse a certain drug, or with giving the mouse a certain kind of exercise treatment, and then draw conclusions from that experiment for how things might be in a human being. So they could compare experimental data about mice with experimental data which they typically could not obtain relating to humans, which would throw light on the potential uses of new drugs and so forth for helping us to treat human diseases. And so since then, the Gene Ontology has received hundreds of millions of dollars from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, because it turned out to be an incredibly important tool for allowing experimental data about what are called model organisms to be useful for understanding human health and disease. So the Gene Ontology made it possible to do biology across the genome. And it led to the development of other ontologies which filled in the gaps, because there are other things other than cellular components, molecular functions, and biological processes which people are interested in when they want to do biology. So the Go is linked to biological science, but it helps us to understand experimental results in biology from a human perspective and from a perspective of human disease. Moreover, because so many people use the Gene Ontology to tag their data and their literature, the Gene Ontology creates a kind of unification of scientific knowledge. So the Vienna Circle wanted to unify scientific knowledge using logic, first-order predicate logic. The Gene Ontology wants to unify scientific knowledge in the life sciences using the nouns and noun phrases and definitions which are found in the Gene Ontology. And so far, the Gene Ontology is having a much greater success than the Vienna Circle. The Vienna Circle attempt to unify science by translating scientific laws into axioms of first-order logic failed. All right, now, having shown the success of the Gene Ontology methodology, the question then arises how you extend it to other areas of science. And in this connection, an initiative called OBO was created. It was created by two people, both of whom were centrally involved in the creation of the Gene Ontology. And initially, they had a portal of 60 ontologies called the Open Ontologies, all of which used a common format and which related to different areas of biology, such as, for instance, fly anatomy. These were organism-specific in some cases, where the mantra of the Gene Ontology was that the Gene Ontology should be organism-neutral in order to enable comparisons across species. Now, OBO was similarly successful, so more and more ontologies were created, and they were included in the OBO portal, because the OBO portal became a standard place where you could go to find ontology content, which would help you to do biology. And this is a list. So they had very early on a cell type ontology. The cellular component ontology is already a part of Go from the very beginning. They have various plant ontologies. They have a fly development ontology. They have an ontology of evidence codes, which are the codes used to specify whether a specific piece of data was derived from an experiment where someone actually saw the relevant phenomenon, or an experiment where the data allowed human inference to that particular piece of data, or an experiment where the data allowed a computational derivation of that particular piece of data. So there are several evidence codes, and basically you want your evidence to be as close as possible to human inspection. So some human being actually saw this thing happen. And then there are more. And now there are many more. Now, in around 2002, 2003, 2003 was the fateful year, actually. I became involved with the Gene Ontology for good or ill. I criticized them severely and in public because their logic was incoherent. And they were sufficiently, I won't say impressed, I would say moved, to want me to help them to try and create a more coherent approach to the logic, particularly the logic of the definitions, but also the logic of the ways in which the different ontologies related to each other. And one aspect of these reform efforts, which was introduced in 2004 by Chris Mungle, who is another central figure in the gene ontology world, was the so-called cross-product definition. And the idea is that we have a gene ontology term which is called osteoblast differentiation. An osteoblast is a kind of cell. And somebody who was using the gene ontology definition of osteoblast differentiation would need to know what an osteoblast is in order to understand the definition. And a computer would need to know what an osteoblast is. If this computer was going to make use of this definition, for instance, to compare data that we have about human osteoblast development with data that we have about osteoblast cells generally. And so we already had a cell ontology in which osteoblast is defined. And so the gene ontology definition does not tell us what that definition is, and it would be expensive to insert a definition within the gene ontology definition of a term which was part of the gene ontology definition. So what you do is you substitute a link to the osteoblast definition. And in this way, you get a gene ontology definition which contains a link to a cell ontology definition as a proper part. Now, the cell ontology definition may contain a link to two other terms which have definitions in other ontologies. And by this means, all the obo ontologies become networked together. And changes in one will automatically bring about corresponding changes in the other. So if you change the definition of osteoblast in the cell ontology, and if the gene ontology definition includes a link to that cell ontology definition, then that change will automatically be accounted for on the side of the gene ontology. So this was a big step forward. And it forced us to improve the logic, not just of the gene ontology, but of all the ontologies. And it was at this point that we created the relation ontology, which was the first formalization of the relations used by biologists when they talk about, for instance, one cell being derived from another cell, or one anatomical structure being adjacent to or connected to another anatomical structure, or one process preceding or being preceded by another process, for instance, in the development of a cell or of a fetus or a fully grown organism. And so once we started to have these logical relations worked out, then we could create what we call the obo foundry, which was originally supposed to be called the obo smithy, but which I vetoed. And the idea of the obo foundry is that now that we have these ways of defining relations between ontologies through the definitions that each ontology contains, we have a way of creating a coherent collection of ontologies rather than just a list. But that's hard work, because now all the ontologies are, in effect, networked together, which means that all of the ontologies are dependent on other ontologies to maintain their biological coherence. So this is the original map of what we call the obo foundry. We have the small ontologies, the molecule ontologies at the bottom, such as the sequence ontology and the protein ontology. Then we have cell ontologies, and then we have organism ontologies, and then we'll see later on, if we get there today, we also have population level ontologies. All right, so this is the slightly more coherent representation of the inner core of the obo list of ontologies, which consists of the early candidate members of the obo foundry. Now, all of these ontologies are representations of universals, what is general in reality: osteoblasts, cells, organisms. These are all kinds of things in virtue of the fact that the instances of those kinds are similar to each other. And these similarities are part of the order of reality. Reality is not made of random pieces which have no relations to each other. It's made of entities which have relations such as the relation of similarity. And so we have two levels. We have the level of universals or types or kinds or classes or species on the one hand, and then we have the level of instances such as Bill Clinton on the other hand. And then we have the instance of relation. For instance, as in Bill Clinton is an instance of organism, to connect these two levels. And the ontologies are responsible for the upper levels, and then we have databases and diaries and journalism and so forth for the lower levels. And we've seen this in an earlier lecture, but now we see how it grew within the specific context of the biological ontologies around the gene ontology. You can have photographs of only of instances. You can't take a photograph of a universal. You can draw a cartoon of a universal or a diagram, but you can't take a photograph. So, and now there are relations between universals which hold because of relations between instances. So if A is a universal and B is a universal, and if every instance of A is an instance of B, then we say big A is a big B. And that is the core relation which holds together all the nodes within the ontology hierarchy. That's the core taxonomical relation, which all ontologies are based on. And then part of is, first of all, an instance level relation. So Mary's heart is an instance level part of Mary. But because we have this instance level relation between instances, we can define a universals level relation between universals. And this is an example of the all-sum principle. A is part of B if all instances of A are instance level parts of some instance of B. Now, one of the earliest coherent exploitations of this kind of approach to understanding how ontologies are organized is the foundational model of anatomy, which is a huge anatomy ontology. This is just a fragment. This is the general stuff. So the FMA divides anatomy into structures and spaces. So the thoracic cavity, which is where your lungs are located, is a subkind of anatomical space. Now, there are different ways in which you can do anatomy ontology. The picture you just saw is a structural anatomy. But some people think that it's important to do anatomy on the basis of the functions of the entities within the organism. Other people think it's sufficient just to organize the way in which the organism is structured spatially. And then other people do development anatomy. They're interested in how the organism evolved. And then still other people do surgical anatomy. So they're interested in how we get to different pieces by cutting or by laser treatments and so forth. All of these are examples of different partitions of the same reality, namely the organism, for instance, the human organism. And the question then is, which partition should be the master partition in terms of which the other partitions are defined? And it turns out that the most appropriate way to understand these different kinds of anatomy is in terms of the structures. And the foundational model of anatomy defines what an anatomical structure is. An anatomical structure is a part of the organism which has been programmed for by a certain subset of the organism's genes. And what that means is that there are some structures in a typical organism which, for one reason or another, are not conformant to what the corresponding genes programmed for. For instance, if you have a fracture in your bone, then that bone is no longer a canonical instance of a bone of that kind because it has had a fracture. And so the foundational model of anatomy is only about the healthy, normal, canonical anatomical structures in what we can think of as an ideal human being. But we use that structural anatomy of the ideal human being in order to describe deviations from structural anatomy brought about, for instance, because of disease or because of accident or because of surgical treatment. All right, so we had the relation ontology was published in 2005, consists of a small set of relations which were recommended for use by all people developing biological ontologies within the OBO framework. And use of these relations was compulsory if you wanted to become a member of the OBO foundry. And we distinguish three kinds of relations. So universal would be, for instance, is that and part of. Instance we've seen already. Instance universal would be the instance of relation, but also a relation like allergic to. So if you're allergic to penicillin, if you are allergic to penicillin, then you are an instance and you are allergic to a certain universal, as it were. All right, so we can define relations in the way that we saw, for instance, in the definition of part of earlier on. We also need a recipe for defining the terms in the ontology. So if we think of an ontology as a graph with nodes, which are the terms, and edges, which are the relations between those terms, then each node in the ontology should have a definition, except the root node, or a root node. An ontology which doesn't have any parents should not have a definition in that ontology. It may be that you can define it in terms taken from another higher level ontology, but the root node should be taken as primitive, and then all the nodes below the root node are defined by means of this procedure. You define each node A by looking at its parent and finding what the specific difference is, which differentiates those instances of the parent which are instances of the child. So Aristotle's, I guess it was Socrates, Aristotle, human is a rational animal. A human is an animal which is rational. That would be an example of this procedure, and these definitions are therefore sometimes called Aristotelian definitions. And if you build your definitions in this way, then the definition process is a check on the correctness of the ontology hierarchy. All right, so we've seen that, and these are some examples. So if we have a zygote which comes into existence because an ovum and a sperm unite, then we have the zygote derives from the ovum. That's an axiom of the ontology. And the zygote derives from the sperm. And if you go to the paper referred to down here, then you will see how that is defined. And then we have another one, transformation of, so an adult is a transformation of a child. It's not true that the child gets transformed into an adult. Universally, that is not the case, because some children die before they become adults. And these are ontological axioms, which means that they satisfy the all-sum rule. Every adult is a transformation of some child. Every larva is a transformation of some pupa. Every mature RNA is a transformation of some pre-RNA, and so forth. And then this is the start of the ontological understanding of embryological development. The formation of the zygote is a case of fusion, but we also have cases of fission, for instance, when cells divide. We also have cases of budding, for instance, when a mother gives birth to a child. And we also have cases of capture or invasion. We need to distinguish between classes and universals, and we need to distinguish between classes and sums. Now, the word class is used as a standard word within the ontology community for the nodes in the ontology. Sometimes they use the word class to mean something like the name. Sometimes they use the word class to mean something like a set theoretic collection of instances. Sometimes I use the word class when I'm feeling friendly towards the orthodox linguistic practices to mean a universal. But if I'm being careful, then I distinguish between classes and sums. So a class is something like a set, which means that it contains members, but the parts of those members are not involved, as it were. They are invisible. We see the world through the granularity determined by the set, which means we only see the members as single whole objects. We don't see the part structure of the members. A mereological sum is not granular in that sense. So the mereological sum contains parts, and it contains all the parts of all those parts, and all the parts of all of those parts of all of those parts, and so on, all the way down to more parts, or quanta of reality, or something that doesn't have any parts. So sets are granular entities, and classes are granular entities. Classes too have members, and class, from this perspective, is really just another way of describing a set of members. And typically, the class will only have members. It will not have other sets as members. So it will be a class of the first level. Sorry, it will be a set of the first level. Now, the problem is that set theory, in the mathematical sense, is part of mathematics, and so it's about certain timeless structures called sets, where we are interested in classes of instances which have as their members entities which have histories. And so we need to be very careful about understanding the relationship between sets on the one hand and classes on the other hand, because we're interested in those classes which exist in time. And only some classes are going to correspond to universals. Because if classes are treated like set theoretic entities, then we have, for any given n instances, 2 to the n classes. But we only have a very small number of universals which would correspond to any of those classes. So we're dealing with what David Armstrong and David Lewis call a sparse ontology. And that's what I'm going to be talking about now. So universals correspond to classes as their extensions, but not every class corresponds to a universal. So we start with entities, and then we have a line between two kinds of entities, universals on the one hand and particulars on the other hand. And the line cannot be crossed. So there is nothing which is both a universal and a particular. And so universals are, we can think of them as being elite entities rather than junk entities. So this remote control iPhone, which I just created, is a junk entity. There is no universe. And I just destroyed it. It just wasn't worth keeping. But elite entities, they survive for a long time, perhaps even forever. And we can have instances within the realm of elite entities. For instance, organisms, as contrasted with remote control iPhones. And we can have classes within the realm of universals. For instance, the population of all human beings, which is the extension of the universal human being. So classes of the sort that we're interested in are sometimes called natural kinds. We're particularly now interested in natural kinds in the realm of biology, although everything that we say can be generalized to other kinds of kinds. Now, we start with classes of objects, what Aristotelians call substances, so Homo sapiens, table. I guess table isn't really biological, so cell would be another good example. And then we have the natural kinds up here, and then the instances of those natural kinds are natural instances. So again, a human being is a natural instance of the natural kind Homo sapiens, where a iPhone remote control, which is different from a remote control iPhone, because now the iPhone is on top, is not a natural instance, because there is no natural kind. So, but then we have in biology a penumbra of borderline cases. For instance, an example of a borderline case of a cell would be a cell which is reaching the end of a process of division. So it looks like a dumbbell. It has two parts and a narrow strand connecting them together. That's not two cells yet, but it's not a natural exemplar of the kind cell. It's a penumbra exemplar. And there are many, so every biological kind has a penumbra of examples, because biology is changing all the time. So there are always instances which are on the fringes being exemplars. And another example would be a femur which has been fractured and lost apart. So it's not anymore a full femur. It's still derived from a femur, but it's a penumbra example. It's a borderline case. And then there are junk instances. So there are entities which are not part of the penumbra of natural kinds. They are just I have here a beach ball desk, which is a desk with a beach ball on top. That's not an instance of any universal, except, trivially, the universal entity. And then we have primitive relations, so which we've seen already, instance of, part of. So Jane is an instance of human. Jane's heart is part of Jane, and that we have the usual axioms of mereology. And then we can start to build taxonomies. And I'm just going to do a little bit of logic. So to say that an E is an F is to say that the class, that E is a class and F is a class. Well, E is now standing for entity. And whenever X, for all X, whenever X is an instance of E, X is also an instance of F. And then we can define a genus as being a class which is such that it has a subclass. And we can define a species as a class which is such that it is the subclass of some other class. And then we can define the nearest species as, so the nearest species of B, namely A, is any species of A which is such that there is no third species which comes between them. And we can then define lowest species, which is a species which is not a genus, and we can define a highest species or root, which is a genus which is not a species. And then we can say that every class is either a genus or a lowest species. We have some axioms. Every class has at least one instance. That's non-trivial. So now, well, a fist is the example I like to use. It may be that there are no fists for a certain period of time, or even forever after a certain point in time, because no one makes any fist. It's become politically incorrect. And it just disappears from history. But we don't. We just assume as an axiom that every class has at least one instance, and then we assume as an axiom that distinct lowest species never share instances. That's non-trivial. Now, it's really non-trivial is the axiom of single inheritance. And the axiom of single inheritance is responsible for the fact that we're dealing here with taxonomies which are true hierarchies in the mathematical sense, which means that there is a single root, and then every node in the ontology or the taxonomy is connected to that root by means of one single branch, which is why it looks like a tree. It's just upside down. So what this means is that every node has exactly one parent. A node can have multiple children, but it can only have one parent. Now, we impose this as a requirement on our ontologies. But it turns out, for instance, even the Gene Ontology has some multiple inheritance because people find it useful for finding things if some terms have multiple parents. It makes logic more difficult to take care of. It makes computation more difficult. And so it's a strong recommendation that when you're building an ontology, you follow the principle of single inheritance. But many people don't. Now, that's not a big deal because we can always show that a multiple inheritance ontology can be decomposed into a plurality of correctly structured single inheritance ontology. And then we have some axioms governing the instance of relation. I won't go through those. So this is a bit like every class has an instance. This says every genus has at least two children. And these are axioms. every instance is also an instance of some lowest species. So there are no instances of mammal which are not also instances of rat or elephant. I guess there are other options, but and then if an instance of a lowest species is an instance of a genus, then the lowest species is a child of the genus, so that you don't get instances which go down illegal branches through the ontology. And then we can prove various theorems. So two distinct classes are either parent-child connected, or they have no instances in common. We can prove various finiteness axioms from what we just gave. If two classes share a child, then they're either identical or one is a subclass of the other. If two genera have a common instance, then they have a common child. And this is a model. And this is what the model is built out of. We can then temporalize the model so that we can deal with those kinds of classes which evolved through time, so we can model evolution. And then we can think about not just classes of objects, substances, but also classes of other entities like functions. But before I move on to that, which is in a way a new chapter, are there any questions about what we just did? This axiomatization is really an axiomatization of Aristotle, and it's based on a very nice paper by a man called Jan Berg, who put forward what he thought was a complete axiomatization of Aristotle's theory of species and genus. Yep.
About the various types of relations, universal instances. I wonder, it seems counterintuitive to think of analogy to a universal instead of single entities. So I'm not allergic to the universal penicillin, but I'm allergic to the thing penicillin.
So the definition of is allergic to would go something like this. An individual X is allergic to a universal Y means X is such that he has an allergic reaction to every instance of Y which is in his environment. That's true. And we try as far as possible always to define relations between universals in terms of relations between instances. And in the BFO OWL version, that's done completely, thoroughly. So we don't have any relations between universals which are not cacheable, outable in terms of relations between instances. Now, in more ambitious approaches, we might want to have some relations like that. Any more questions? All right. So functions. There are various standard views of what functions are. Millikan is responsible for one standard view, which it says that functions are dispositions of parts of organisms, the exercise or manifestation of realization of which is responsible for you existing. So to say that it's the function of your heart to pump blood is to say that you exist, and part of the reason for you existing is that your ancestors had hearts which pumped blood. Now, this certainly seems to me to be a good step towards a good definition of biological function. It doesn't help very much for functions of artifacts. There is a simplified view of this, which does work for artifacts, which says that the function is a disposition which is such that the exercise or realization or manifestation of that disposition is beneficial. In the case of the biological case, it's beneficial to the survival of the host organism. And in the case of an artifact, it means it's beneficial to the designer and to the potential customers or users or recipients or owners of the artifact in this case. So on standard views, there are two kinds of entities which have functions: parts of organisms and deliberately designed artifacts. And one standard view says that those entities which have functions are the entities which have been designed by God on the one hand, which are the biological ones, and by engineers on the other hand, or designers of artifacts. So I and BFO also have defended a view which is somewhere in the vicinity of the Millikan simple forward-looking view. And the idea is that only material entities have functions. And only material entities which have been deliberately designed or parts of organisms have functions. So you yourself do not have a function. No organism has a function. Possibly there are organism artifacts. For instance, bacteria which have been specially designed in order to serve certain purposes. They may have a function, but then they have a function not because they are organisms, but because they are artifacts. And the idea is that one way of understanding what it is to be canonical in the world of anatomy is to say that a canonical entity is an entity, a canonical entity in the anatomical makeup of an organism like a human being is an entity which is functioning canonically. So to be a canonical heart is to be a heart which pumps blood successfully, appropriately, not too fast, not too slow, regularly, pumps more if you're running or otherwise using oxygen. And gradually, of course, the parts of your body are going to cease to be functioning with the full efficiency. We hope that some of them are. It'd be a shame if you died and you were still healthy. But gradually, crucial parts of your organism cease to function, and then there occurs what we call death. I want to talk next about biological taxa, and I am stealing some really nice slides by someone who knows how to do slide design, by Stefan Schultz and his colleagues they were then in Freiburg, they're now in Graz in Austria, or Stefan is. Stefan is coming to Buffalo in September. So we have some examples of taxa. What we're trying to understand is how the collection of classes in the realm of organisms is organized. And there are standard taxonomies, some of which go back all the way to the Greeks. But the world's first mature taxonomy was created by Linnaeus, who was a follower of Aristotle, who applied Aristotle's methodology in order to produce a taxonomy of the kinds of organisms about which he knew. And so we have different levels. So we have species, genera, subfamilies, families, superfamilies, orders, classes, subphyla, phyla, and then kingdoms. And the kingdom referred to here is animals, and then we have chordates and arthropods, vertebrates, mammals, primates, human-like species, and then I don't know what simian troglodytes are. I guess they are. Anyway. And similarly for insects. So we're interested particularly in hominids. So hominids include bonobos and then French philosophers over there. No, sorry, that's orangutans. And so each chimpanzee, so this one is called Washoe, is an instance of chimpanzee and thereby also an instance of hominid. So this is the way to organize species, not by means of these orders. We have a single hierarchy. And we have just the subclass relation, which is ISA, which is defined exactly as I defined it earlier on. And then orangutan is a hominid is a primate, chimpanzee is a hominid. These are particulars down here, then there's the relation of instantiation. So Stefan knows what he's doing. And then in the old world, they would say, well, then we have these ISA relations, and we have the instances down here, but then we have a second set of instance relations. So the subfamily of primates is an instance of order. Now that, from the single hierarchy view that Aristotle defended and that I just expounded axiomatically, is wrong. Universals are never instances of other universals. Only particulars are instances, and we have a single hierarchy going all the way up. So, how do we do that? Well, first of all, we recognize that there are classes of chimpanzees, which are populations. And the species is a big population. It's an instance. It's the population of chimpanzees, which is changing from time to time as more chimpanzees are born and other chimpanzees die. But at any given time, there is one or more chimpanzee populations, which is what Stefan calls a granular part of the total population of chimpanzees. What he means by granular part is that the same grain structure, which is to say one chimpanzee, one chimpanzee, one chimpanzee, is present both in the whole and in the part. All right, so, and then we have two chimpanzee populations. Those two chimpanzee populations may become separated by a river. The river gets broader and broader. The chimpanzee populations can't mate. And they gradually, through generation after generation, they become different so that they could no longer mate even if they met. And that means that we had a speciation event. That the division of the two populations gave rise, through the course of evolutionary development, to two separate populations. All right, so these red lines are still the instance of relation. And now we can collapse the whole thing into a single inheritance, a single hierarchy. So, because now we don't look at the populations anymore or at the organisms anymore, we look at qualities. Now, the qualities in the BFO sense are something like the DNA patterns. So there is a certain DNA pattern which all chimpanzees share. There is a certain DNA pattern which all bonobos share. And the DNA pattern which all chimpanzees share, every instance of the DNA pattern which a chimpanzee has is also an instance of a DNA pattern which every member of the family Hominides has, which is also an instance of the same DNA pattern that the primate order instances have, so that if we look at this hierarchy in terms of qualities, in virtue of which populations are regarded as populations of the same species, then we can turn the traditional multi-hierarchy view of orders and families and species into a single hierarchy view in which all the biological organization is represented by a single is-our relation. And then the interesting thing is that hearts, and he's got this heart to pump, which is a really clever piece of PowerPoint design. Must have taken him years. This too has the same DNA. So if it's a chimp heart, actually it's Homo sapiens, as you can see. If it's a Homo sapiens heart, it will have the same DNA quality as all whole Homo sapiens instances. All right. So we have an organization of qualities. And then we can go on to talk about the regions of space where we find organisms of different kinds, using the has-location relation. And then we get to the environment ontology, which was the next thing I wanted to talk about. So are there any questions about Sibian troglodytes?
So I get how bonobo and chimpanzees are separate species because they can't mate. But what
Yeah.
about like lions and tigers where they can mate, but then they have a sterile offspring, or like a horse and a donkey can mate and have a sterile offspring?
So we just specified carefully that they have to be able to mate productively. In other words, it has to be a real relationship which goes on through the generation. There are much more difficult questions with the mating criterion or matability, reproductive matability criterion, when you're talking about non-sexually reproducing organisms. So the matability criterion really only works for sexually reproducing organisms. Even there it has problems. But for bacteria, you need a quite different approach. And then you have to use the DNA quality approach or something like it in order to talk about species at all. All right. So, any more questions? So, one of the areas where the OBO community realized the need for ontological content is in connection with environments. So, some environments are wholes in an obvious sense. I think all environments are wholes, actually, with an H, but sometimes in a less than obvious sense. But that's only in one sense of environment. So the term environment is used by biologists in multiple different ways. Sometimes they mean something like a habitat. Sometimes they mean something like a home, as in this case here. Sometimes, or niche, as in the case of a place within, well, I will come back to niche later on. Sometimes they mean what they call a biome, which is to say an area on the surface of the planet where the climate and other environmental conditions are appropriate for organisms of certain sorts. And then the total biome is the sum of all of those specific kinds of biomes, which would be of the planet, that feature of the planet, which is such that it is able to host organisms. So in the most general sense, an environment is a phenomenon, part, structure, feature, we'll have to work out what precisely, which can host an organism. And if you're going to host an organism, there has to be a hole there. And the organism has to be able to live in that hole. So this is another example of an environment. This is another example of a transient environment. And this is the double hole structure of the occupied niche, as I like to call it. So the cave, the bear is in the cave. The cave is the niche in this sense of the bear. There is a boundary, which is a physical boundary, created by the cave, and then there is the mouth of the cave, which is a fiat boundary. And the bear, there is the environment there is the atmosphere, the air within the cave. This hole with a W, formed by particles of air and so forth in this particular location, has a hole inside it with an H, in virtue of the fact that the bear is taking up the space which would otherwise have been occupied by air molecules. So we have a double hole. We have the hole, and then we have the hole, which is the hole with an H, which corresponds to the volume of the hole with a W, cave. And then we have another hole with an H, which corresponds to that part of that volume, which is occupied by the organism, which is hosted by the cave. And then we can talk about the medium of the niche. So if you're going to have an organism which is hosted by a niche, then there has to be some medium which can support life. For instance, air, water, nasal mucosa, which is what supports the life of all the bacteria inside your nostril, which is another kind of niche, with many, many organisms inside it. All right, and then the niche can be empty, and that's because the organism left, which means that there is a sort of criterion which says that an organism has to be able to leave its niche and has to be able to enter its niche. But some niches will make it very difficult for the organism to leave, for protection, for instance, or for other organisms to enter, also for protection. And some niches will make it very easy, because the organism in question wants to get out of the niche very quickly in order to kill a shark from on high. So that's the niche of a flying buzzard, which doesn't have any material boundary at all. It's just it just has a power projection zone. That's also the niche of an F-16 flying over the Spratly Islands. And that would be the opposite extreme, which is an egg or a spaceship. You really don't want to be able to get out of your spaceship easily, nor do you want other organisms to get into it easily. And then this would be the niche of a cow on a field. So there is a border, a material border underneath the cow, and then there is a fiat canopy. And then this would be the niche that we started with, the niche of the rabbit, or the mole, or whatever it was. Now, so that's one basic view. This is a kind of spatial view of niches. Niches are regions of space which have a certain retainer medium structure. The retainer contains the medium allows the organism to survive, and the medium and the retainer together provide a certain combination of protection, food access, accessibility by the organism, and non-accessibility by predator organisms and so forth. I believe that every niche is like this. But biologists are not interested only in the spatial sense of niche. In fact, that's probably, for their theoretical point of view, the least interesting aspect of a niche. They're much more interested in aspects having to do with qualities which make life possible, having to do with things like climate and food availability and so forth. So one very famous view of niche, defended or propounded by a biologist by the name of Elton, one of the fathers of ecology, says that the niche is a role. So when an ecologist says, "There goes a badger," what he means is some idea of the badger's place in the community. So the river, the straw, whatever it is that badgers do their thing with. Just as if he had said, "There goes the vicar." So the vicar has a role, and there wouldn't be vicars if there weren't churches and parishes and pews and lecterns and church services and marriages and so forth. So that's the environment of the vicar, and the niche within that environment which the vicar holds, which is different from the niche in that environment which the young virgin holds, or the choir boy or choir girl, I suppose, these days, is the niche which means that it's him that goes and gives the sermon and so forth. And similarly, the niche in the environment of the badger, which the badger holds, is the niche where the badger is the animal which goes out and catches a fish and builds badger dams. Do they build dams? Anyway, whatever badgers do. But there are specific things which badgers do, and they can do them only in certain environments. For instance, find fish that they can eat, and water, and so forth. So I'm perfectly happy to accept that there is this sense of the word niche also, which goes hand in hand with the original sense of the word niche. And I guess we could say that G.E. Hutchinson formalized the Elton view. He defined a niche as an n-dimensional hyperspace where the dimensions are what he calls environmental gradients, which means they are dimensions along which a certain environmental quality varies. So it might be temperature. A given organism can only live within this kind of temperature zone, and it can only be reproductively very fit and have lots of ancestors if he or she is in this narrower zone. And then you have maybe 19 different dimensions which create a kind of gigantic multidimensional evolutionary hotel with many rooms. And organisms evolve to fit into each of those rooms. And so that's a picture. So you imagine this is 19 dimensions. This is the temperature dimension. This is the availability of edible leaf dimension. This is the predator dimension, and so on. And there is zones along this dimension, and the zones along this dimension which create subzones into which organisms evolve. So this is the environmental hyperspace view. So, degree of slope, exposure to sunlight, and so forth. Now, we developed the ontology called ENVO to combine the spatial view, which I explained earlier, the actual field or the actual area in the sky or in the subsoil, with the Hutchinsonian view, so that we have dimensions of variability in environmental qualities. And this creates multidimensional zones within which organisms have evolved. And the zones have central area where they evolve, live, and have high fitness, and then surrounding that is a penumbral view, and if they get too close to the edges of the zone, they die or they don't reproduce. And so we've been applying ENVO in various parts of biology. So one place where it's applied is in annotating museum artifacts. So you want to say where these seeds, for instance, were found, what kind of soil, what kind of climate they grow in. This may be important information if you want to reproduce those seeds in order to do experiments about pharmaceutical properties of the plants. So and you want to grow more of them, so you need to know where they were originally found. And you can use it to tag images of different kinds of environmental features. And most importantly, you can use it to tag data about biological samples. So just let me see. So there are, if you go to the web, various websites where you can buy bacterial strains or other kinds of biological samples. And you will find a list then of different bacterial strains that you can buy, which you might need for your experiments. And it will tell you where the bacteria were found. And one of the ideas behind ENVO was that ENVO would provide a controlled vocabulary for describing where bacterial samples were found. So if you go there without ENVO to one of these sites, you might say that this particular bacterial strain was found in a lake. So you don't know where the lake was, you don't know what kind of lake, you don't know what country it was found, or you might go and you find a bacterial strain was found in New York. So that doesn't tell you anything about the kind of climate where the bacteria arose or what the host was, and so forth. So this is a sample of some of the ENVO terms that we then added to the ontology. So we have things like a carcass, or a fossil, or animal litter, or a nest of an ant, or a nest of a bird. And all of these are places where you might find organisms, or you might find specific kind of biological phenomena, for instance, diseases. And you want to annotate the information you have about those phenomena to track how diseases move from one kind of environment to another, for instance. And so that's what ENVO is used for. And currently, ENVO is the heart of the ontology work that we're doing for the United Nations Environment Project, where we're dealing with things like how environments for human beings can become more resilient against things like floods or famine and so forth. So there is a story to the effect that biologists who study these things predicted that by the year 2100 or so, all cow strains, all currently existing cow strains in Western countries will have foot and mouth disease. So we won't be able to eat their beef. But there are cow strains in Africa which do not have this problem. They are not inevitably going to be such that all the cows will have foot and mouth disease. And so they are tracking those cow communities in Africa in order to make sure that we can keep some of those cows alive so that we can import them into the Western countries and still eat meat and not catch diseases. And ENVO was being used as part of the effort of collecting data about these African cow strains so that we could do environmental protection. So this is where the ENVO fits into the OBO foundry. So there are environments at every level. There are molecular environments, cellular environments, which is where bacteria are to be found. And then there are environments for whole organisms. There are organ environments like the thoracic cavity. And then there are environments for single families, communities. For instance, Harlem is an environment for certain communities of Baptists, for instance. And whole populations. And then, just as the molecules are parts of the cells are parts of the organisms are parts of the families, so a molecular environment will be part of a cellular environment, which will be part of an organ environment, and so forth. And now these are some of the names so biome, biotope, habitat, work environment, host environment. The host symbiont environment means the environment where two organisms, one of which is, for instance, an elephant flea and the flea. I mean the elephant. That's a host symbiont environment. And then there are cellular and molecular environments. And then this is the upper level view of the environmental feature ontology. So we have anthropogenic features, which political entity is a sub-kind, hydrographic features such as lakes and so forth. And then the big family for biological purposes of environmental features are habitats, and then we have cultivated habitats, which is agriculture, terrestrial habitats, which is things like deserts, and anthropogenic habitats, which is things like nuclear power stations. And then we have an ontology of biomes. So we have terrestrial biomes, aquatic biomes. I guess we would need eventually to have interstellar biomes or biomes for spatial. Well, for, I don't know, do we have organisms up there? Not many. So there is the Udvari classification of biomes. There's the World Wildlife Federation classification, World Wildlife Fund classification of biomes, and then there is the Bailey classification of biomes. So we have three classifications of biomes. All right, so that's an interesting example of a surface environment, because you may have many of those inside you. So biomes are regions of space within which certain kinds of environmental conditions are realized, which allow certain corresponding kinds of organisms to live. And of course, you can make biome classifications which are very granular, or you can make biome classifications which are very detailed. And you can have different levels of biome classification. That's why we have these different biome classifications, each of which has different customers, different uses. And it turns out that the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, uses another classification of biomes called the Omernic classification. So Bailey's system classifies eco-regions, and you can see some of the characteristic style of people who don't think ontologically. So eco-regions are large ecosystems of regional extent that contain a number of smaller ecosystems. Now, here he's using region in two different senses. In the first sense, a region is a system. In the second sense, a region is a part of the planet. It's a spatial region. And he's defining the one in terms of the other, which is what he should have done first of all is define system, which is what we do in EMBO, and then define a biome as an ecological system. And then we define subbiomes in terms of spatial extent. So a tropical biome, an equatorial biome, an Arctic biome. And then he has region, then he introduces zone, and then he says that the regions which are systems are in fact zones, and then he says the zones represent geographical groups of similarly functioning ecosystems. So geographical zones are just what they are. They don't represent anything. What he means is that have as typical inhabitants or typically present, typically manifest specific kinds of ecosystems. For instance, large mammalian predator ecosystems, because large mammalian predators can survive in sparsely populated, warm climates. That kind of thing. Anyway, that's probably enough eco-region classification. So these are all fiat entities. All of those biomes are regions, and we distinguish tropical and equatorial regions by a line around the planet, or multiple lines, and they are fiat boundaries. And this is a picture of an eco-region delineation. And this is another example where we have an ontology down the right. The legend is an ontology, and then the ontology is mapped onto a representation of instances, which in this case are instances made up of points on the surface of the planet, or the United States, actually. All right, I don't think we need that. These are the Bailey biomes, the maximal Bailey biomes. So all instances of any given Bailey universal, so the Bailey universals are things like polar domain, dry domain, humid temperate domain, and so on, gets the same color on this picture. And so I guess that's the dry domain. No, the dry domain, I guess, is there. Colorado and Libya. All right, now in addition to ENVO, we or Michael Ashburner more specifically, created an ontology-like artifact called GAS. And GAS is it's a gazetteer. In other words, it contains names not for universals, but for instances in the realm of environments. So instances would include things like London or the Sahara Desert or Guam or Bermuda. They are all listed in an ontologically structured way in GAS. And the goal that we were pursuing, and which I guess we are still pursuing, although we're not making considerable progress, was to annotate all the terms in GAS with corresponding terms in ENVO. All right, now we have the relation ontology. I'm coming now to politics. But before we do politics, do we have any questions so far?
So I have a question.
Yep.
So I played around a little bit with some niche ontology ideas, but a lot of my ideas were about trying to establish ways of conceiving of the function of the habitat, whereas it seemed like a lot of the terms in the environmental ontology presented were just proper nouns of places, zones, and regions, as though they would be kind of like primitively represented in the data.
When you say proper names, you mean things like London and the Sahara Desert? And
Yeah.
so I think you must have been looking at an older version of ENVO or at some compound of ENVO and GAS.
I guess what I'm wondering is there a way in the ontology that these things are sort of generated? Or could we say that the organism has certain sorts of Hutchinsonian dimensions that allow us to
I see what you mean.
It has this kind of boundary.
So the ENVO, and this is true of all the ontologies in the OVO family, was not generated by means of any kind of algorithm or combinatorial approach. You can use it for combinatorial purposes, but the ontology itself was generated manually. And it was generated, first of all, by people with some knowledge of geography, although they were not geographers, they were biologists who had developed a knowledge of geography because they were marine biologists or they were biologists interested in the geospatial patterns of diseases, that kind of thing. They developed the ontology by listing all the terms they knew they needed, creating an ontology, repairing the ontology to give it some kind of structure, and then it became used by different communities, for instance, the Biome communities, who then wanted their terms for the different biome classes to be added. So all of the ontologies grow in that way, and it's not ideal from the perspective of automatic generation, but if you try to generate ontologies automatically, the experience so far is that you create nonsense. So too many of the combinations are insignificant from the point of view of use. Well, doing it manually, you more or less are guaranteed to have terms which do have some kind of use. Any more questions? All right, so the relation ontology was created for biological purposes, but as we saw, relations like fusion and fission and invasion are also relevant for, I won't say non-biological phenomena, I will say phenomena at a human and population scale, including things like politics and war. So we've been here already, but now we're going to go here. This is one of my favorite examples of a it's not a political phenomenon, it's a religious phenomenon with a considerable local political significance. So I used to live in Manchester in England, and Manchester has a large suburban Jewish population, mainly European Jews who came to England in the 19th and early 20th century. And I remember when I was living there, I heard a news item to the effect that a group of Jews living in one of these suburbs, had requested planning permission from the local city planning authority to build a ghetto. Now, when I heard this, I thought, that's strange. And only much later did I discover that what they were wanting to do was to create what in Jewish legal and Orthodox Jewish circles is called an eruv. And an eruv is an area within town or within a habited environment in which Orthodox Jews are allowed to do certain things on the Sabbath, which they are not allowed to do outside the Eruv. So an Eruv is a fiat zone, and there is an Eruv in Los Angeles, and this is the web address for the Los Angeles Eruv, and immediately before the beginning of Sabbath, they have a laser-guided system which checks whether the Eruv is, as I say, up. Now what that means is something like this. You're allowed to do certain things, for instance, wear spectacles in your own home or in someone else's home. So you're allowed to carry jewelry and various things, which you would want to do, but only in your home or in somebody else's home. So the question is, what is a home? Well, a home has to have walls, but then it has to have doors, because you have to get in and out. And so, in principle, a home could have many doors, provided there is some kind of connected layer all around the home. So basically, a home is a layer, a solid layer, with doors, and then maybe walls. But the walls are not necessary, providing there is a solid layer. And so an Eruv typically will be created by stringing fishing line along telegraph poles to form a circle. And then that's your home. And inside that circle, you're allowed to wear jewelry and push prams. And there are many Eruvs. They're all over the world. And the LA Eruv has a laser-guided system so that they can check that the fishing line is unbroken automatically, and then the website posts that the Eruv is up, which means that people can rush out with their perambulators and carry jewelry and do those other things. So, it's a ceremonially demarcated area which uses, it doesn't have to be horizontal wires, they also have to have tiny vertical black rubber strips where the doors are. Now, if you didn't know about Eruvs, you wouldn't know that you were in an Eruv. So this is what it looks like if your town has an Eruv. And that's not fishing line, that's a telephone or electricity cable. But there is an Eruv line connecting those poles. So it's called an Eruv because it mixes a public area, because anyone can walk through an Eruv. It's not restricted to the Orthodox Jews. But it's converted halakhically, which means according to Jewish law, into a private area. It's a home. So when you walk through an Eruv, and there are 35 Eruvs in Manhattan, so you've all, I'm sure, walked through many Eruvs, you don't know that you're walking through somebody else's home. So this is, anyone know how to pronounce Tenafly? Is Tenafly correct? So there is an Eruv in Tenafly, and some residents of Tenafly didn't like the idea that they were living in an Eruv. They found out about it, and so they took the Tenafly to court to protest. Now, there are various reasons why you might protest. Why you might, if you were an idiot. One reason would be that it will do damage to your property values. But actually, if you're lucky enough to have a house in an Eruv, it will go up in value, because it's for certain kinds of people, it's a mark of a reason why you might want to live there. So the arguments that were made by the non-Jewish residents of Tenafly were that they never asked permission to attach things to telegraph poles, which is clearly something they should have done, when in fact the telegraph poles are full of notices of missing dogs and so forth. In any case, people have been sticking things to telegraph poles in every New Jersey community since the beginning of time. So that can't be a good reason either, but that was one of the reasons they used. So eventually, the Tenafly Council got the case to the Supreme Court, so that it was the local council that was suing the Tenafly Erev Association. So,
Am I reading that right? It happened during Jewish Week? They went to
oh no, that's the newspaper. This is an extract.
Duh.
So they were placing signs or advertisements. Now these things are practically speaking invisible. You would not know that you were in an error. And other things had been attached to poles which were much more visible, but no one had ever complained. So they complained about invisible fishing line. This is the a picture of a sign. That this really is a visible sign, but I guess they got permission. This is, I believe, in Manhattan. But now I don't know that that's the name of the place. That may be the name of the photographer. They had a problem. This may actually be Montreal. They had a big problem in Montreal, also because some residents in Montreal complained about the Montreal Eruv. This is a map of the Chicago Eruv, which is it's a bit like a cell in process of cell division. They could very easily convert that into two errors, but then they would have a problem if they tried to cross between the two. This is the Washington error, which is really big. So the Supreme Court is inside the Washington error.
It's a lot of fishing line.
And then there are several in London. And in London they had objectors. And in this case it was the Orthodox Jews who objected. Because the really Orthodox Jews didn't like the fact that the Eruv building slightly less Orthodox Jews were in effect cheating. Because they were not following the laws necessary for social order, because they were doing it inside an Eruv. So the liberal Jews objected because they didn't want to recreate ghettos, and the really Orthodox Jews objected because they were making life too easy. And then the secular objected because it was impinging on their human rights to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So I guess if I had to choose, I would go with the really Orthodox Jews here. Because these people are talking nonsense. So this is a French philosopher type. The Eruv seems to symbolically stain space, which is a typical piece of nonsense. So this is the liberal objection to the Barnett Eruv. Eruv believers would happily pass through their symbolic gateways in the streets, but everyone else would be compelled to do so without benefit, even if the compulsory passage through the Eruv structures is offensive to a person's beliefs. Total nonsense. So what mistake are they making? First of all, I don't know that the objectors were in every case anti-Semitic. But some of them were. They just didn't like the idea that they were living in a place where Jewishness was symbolically staining their space. So this is what you are. If you walk here, you're not likely to look up there or even there. So you're walking here. This is a street I think it's in New York City. You don't know that there is an Eruv there. And if you worry that there is an Eruv boundary there, if you're worried that there is an Eruv boundary there, you're not understanding what a boundary is. It's like the boundary between the parish of the St. Peter, St. Paul Church in Williamsville and the parish of the next church along in some other part of Amherst. No one knows that they're walking across those parish boundaries. All right. Now, why do people have this tendency to be disturbed by the idea that Arabs are being created. Well, I think that part of it is that there is a tendency within Western civilization, which was entrenched around about the time of 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, to see the world as being divided into sovereign states which don't overlap and which have crisp boundaries between each other. Now, you remember the video of the way England came into existence. So in other parts of the world, that process was much more bloody and much more spread out. And there were many more wars fought in order to bring about a situation where there was a unitary nation state. Most of those, or many of those wars were fought either in Germany or partly in Germany and partly in the surroundings of Germany. This is why the Treaty of Westphalia is so important, because that treaty solved the main reason for the fights between different zones within what we now call Germany, basically the Protestant zones and the Catholic zones, over who should control the territory. So the Peace of Westphalia declared a division of Germany into principalities, and each principality would get one religion, which would be the religion of the corresponding prince, who may also be a bishop, and people would accept the division of the German region, the German geographical region, into these separate principalities, separate countries, and they would stop killing each other. So they would just accept that these borders were inviolate, and that they would accept that the principalities did not overlap. So this was a partition in the same technical sense that we've been talking about in several of the classes so far. Partition of the German or the Holy Roman Empire, effectively, but we're interested particularly in Germany for the moment. So within each principality, or some of them were kingdoms, the king or the sovereign has all rights without any reserve, with all manner of jurisdiction and sovereignty. He can decide the religion of the inhabitants. And if you don't like it, then you can leave. Now, this turned out to be a very good thing. This led to peace. You didn't have continual wars of religion. It was a good idea. It's still a good idea. But it's an idea which, in the Western way of thinking about geopolitical phenomena, has become entrenched, so that disturbances from this idea, departures from this idea, annoy people surreptitiously. And map makers find problems dealing with such disturbances or departures. So, 1624 was declared the standard year where territories were deemed to be either in Roman Catholic or Protestant possession. And a prince would forfeit his lands if he changed his religion. And the footnote here, are we going to be able... Some people think that the Westphalian paradigm is being brought to an end because there are no borders on the internet. And they're not completely stupid. So this was the result. This is a beautiful tessellation of Germany. It's not completely beautiful. If you look at the red things down here, they're all one country, for instance. And it's, where you see things with the same color, they are one country. So countries were not yet topologically continuous with themselves, but they were at least spatially non-overlapping, which was a big step in the right direction. So this is where we were by 1914, and this is where, well, this was modeled on the Treaty of Westphalia, but with slightly more attention to topological connectedness, and with no hesitation at all in straight lines being used as boundaries. But there are still some overlapping partitions. So these are Native American reservations. And so that there are some very, very strange phenomena among the Native American reservations. There are chessboard-like reservations. And those reservations gave the Native Americans the black squares and the other lot, the white squares, because no one knew where the valuable farmland or minerals might be. And so in order to ensure that both sides got an equal shot at getting the riches, they divided the territory in a chessboard, a geometrically perfectly symmetrical tessellation. But there are then non-Westphalian partitions. So the Antarctic is not a Westphalian partition. It's a condominium. Several countries own it. And the moon is a condominium. Berlin used to be owned by 4 different countries simultaneously. There is a river which is both in Luxembourg and in Germany. But the really interesting case is Lake Constance. So Lake Constance is a lake which has three countries bordering: Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. And they never agreed as to where the boundary between their 3 countries should be in the lake. So it's not that there is no boundary, because each of those 3 countries has its view as to where the boundary lies. But they're different views, so they have inconsistent views about where their country lies. So we have a logically inconsistent set of boundaries in Lake Constance, which have certain consequences. So if you buy a ticket on the boat to go, I think, from Austria to Switzerland, the ticket is the Austrians think that the border is in the middle of the lake, and you can only buy, and the Swiss don't accept that view. And so in Austria you can buy a ticket to the border with Switzerland, but then the rest of your journey is free, because the ticket is only valid to the border of Austria. So the boats take you anyway, because they can't let you get off the boat in the middle of the lake. The Germans think that the boundary is where basically the beach comes to an end. So the 3 feet, where the water is 3 feet deep, or a little bit more. And the Swiss hold that it's a condominium, so they all own it. So the Lake Constance is shared between the 3 countries, which is, from certain practical points of view, the most reasonable, because there are many things that you have to do collectively anyway. For instance, water pollution measures and so forth. Now, this is logically truly interesting, but practically they have worked out legal agreements. So if you die in the middle of the lake, it might be very important where you die, which country you die in, for one or another reason. So you may get your inheritance if you died in Austria, whereas if you die in Switzerland, then they won't give it to you. So they have treaties, bilateral treaties. I don't know how many there are, but there are quite a few. And they specify precisely where you die, depending on where in the lake you die and which law you are subject to. And then maybe if there are several parties, so if you die on a boat owned by Switzerland and you are Austria and you die in Germany, then they will have a special way of dealing with the question of where you die. Now, as you can understand, people never talk about this. They never say that this is a black hole in the middle of Europe, where normal Euclidean geometry no longer holds, because everyone assumes that we are still governed by the Treaty of Westphalia. Why would anyone not divide their country clearly with the next? And they all do, it's just they do it in a different way. All right, so there was a temporary non-Westphalian partition of the Netherlands in consequence of the Lockerbie bombing. I don't know if you were even alive in the Lockerbie bombing, but they decided to make a part of Holland be Scottish, so that they could have the trial on Scottish soil. Now this is Eruv kind of thinking. Well, we talked about Lake Constance. Okay, this is the official view. So Switzerland takes the view that the border runs through the middle of the lake. Austria takes the view that all three countries have shared sovereignty. Germany takes the view that Germany takes no view on the matter. Then we have the one-sided boundary. So the Berlin Wall and the boundary between West Germany and East Germany was only a boundary on the eastern side. The West Germans didn't recognize that boundary at all because they didn't recognize East Germany. So we had a boundary which pointed in only one direction, which is also the direction the guns were pointing in the other direction. So from the western side, it's just a wooden fence. This is not a very good image. But from the eastern side, it's a massive collection of fences and minefields and machine gun posts. And then the most interesting case, this is the pièce de résistance of all remaining non-Westphalian boundaries, occurs in the south of the Netherlands or the north of Belgium, whichever you prefer. And the letter B here stands for Baal or Bale. And if you go closer, you will see that the green bits here have got confused. So these are all parts of Belgium. This is Holland. And these are parts of Holland inside Belgium. And this is a close-up. So there are counter exclaves, but there are no counter exclaves. So there are no parts of Belgium which are parts of Holland, which are parts of Belgium, which are parts of Holland. But you get 3 levels deep. And so this is a part of Holland, which is part of Belgium, which is part of. So, and there are some houses which are, the one side of the house is part of Holland and the other side is part of Belgium. So, the way they solve this is to, if it's necessary to be solved, it's where the front door is. So this is the only case where the house is actually in both countries. Because the other cases, they move the front doors in order to clarify matters. And they have, so this is a small village, basically, and there are Catholics on one side, which have their own Catholic church, who are Belgians, who speak Flemish, which is Dutch with some changes, but they speak a very Dutch Flemish. And then on the other side, there are Catholics with their own Catholic church, who speak Dutch, but with a very Flemish accent. They have 2 post offices, and if you send a letter in the Belgian side to go just to the other side of the street, it has to go to Brussels to be sorted, and then it will be brought back. If you send it from the Dutch side with a different letterbox, then it will have to go to The Hague or wherever. They have gravestone. They only have one cemetery, but it's a small village. But each gravestone has a Dutch flag or a Belgian flag, a little porcelain etched flag. They very rarely intermarry because Catholics, well, very often marry other Catholics, but not if they're Dutch or Belgian. And none of it really matters anymore because they're both part of the European Union. So there are no customs or border posts. There are yellow lines along the streets so that you know whether you're in Germany or in Belgium or Holland. In the olden days, however, they were a smuggler's paradise because they became rather wealthy because they could move goods from one country to another and back again within a few seconds. So you get better chocolate on the Belgian side. That's about it. And but now there was something even better which is the enclaves of Kuch Behar. So this is a picture here. And here you have counter enclaves. So you have parts of Bangladesh, which are parts of Pakistan, which are parts of Bangladesh, which are parts of Pakistan, which are parts of Bangladesh. And one of them is shaped like a snowflake, because it was originally a prince's palace with a very, very beautifully designed wall. And unfortunately, just I think a couple of years ago, after a lot of really hard political effort, they created a new boundary treaty, and they eliminated this wonder of mankind. Now, it was actually pretty rotten to live in one of those enclaves, because if you needed to call the police, that was a problem. So they were very poor, and now maybe they will be slightly less poor. But there are still maps. So, and if you look at a map of Bangladesh, you won't see any of this, because the map makers are all Westphalians. There are 4 British territorial enclaves in Cyprus, for what that's worth. And of course, Israel. So I think that Israel is, in fact, I wrote an article called The Cognitive Geometry of War, in which I argued that part of the reason why people fight in this particular area, where we have a very non-Westphalian division of a certain territory, is because people think that Westphalian division of territory is the only just division of territory. This is Chinatown in Manchester. They built this as a ceremonial entryway into Chinatown. Now, no one sued the Manchester City Council for creating this boundary marker. Some of the Arabs in New York overlap each other. So you have Arabs which overlap with other Arabs. So you have to keep the telephone wires straight. So we've had all of that. And now, why is the Westphalian paradigm so I think it does speak to something in the psychology of people who grew up in the West. I don't think it applies necessarily to other cultures, but people who grew up in the West like to own property. And if you own property, you don't want somebody else to own property which is inside your property. You want to have a farm which is continuous and which is not divided up into other bits which are owned by other landowners. And similarly, if you want to live in a country, you want your country to be connected and contiguous. You don't want your country to be invaded or occupied or populated by other kinds of people who are not belonging to your country. Now, and that's because we want to place our mark on reality. We want to prove that we lived here. So we don't just want to pass through a particular area. We want to pass through that area and own it and farm it and develop it, create a country, or create property that we can own. And so the people who live in Montreal or in Tenafly or in Barnet think that they're living in their own country. They think that they're living in their own community, ruled by their own community, and they find out that there are people inside their community who are building a boundary around a sub-region within their community, and they get upset. Even though the boundary is purely symbolic, they still get upset.